Okay, so welcome. Today we'll see forms. That was the topic that we started last time. We just saw a few slides and tried to understand conceptually what the forms were. So today we will dive on the forms and we will work on some practical examples concerning the forms. Okay, so first we said that the goals of these slides, of this part of the course, is to understand how the HTML tags, or which HTML tags do we have for the form inputs, to learn the validation techniques, and then we will implement the integration between the forms and the Flask. So last time I remember we said that the forms span across the front end and the back end, because on the back end we have all the validations that the user has to fulfill to submit something, and then on the back end we have to deal with the data that the user has submitted through the forms. So first of all, today we will start with the front end of the forms. We will see how to integrate them into the HTML, which are the most popular tags that we have available for working with forms, and then we will move to the backend. So I don't know if you remember this slide, this graphic. It was about an HTTP request, right? So in this HTTP request, so far, I don't know if you can see, but here we have a GET, no? So what does this GET means in this request? That we are asking something from the server. In this case, we are sending a HTTP request with this method, and we are expecting to receive something from the server. What happens with the forms? It's different, because with the forms, we are not expecting to get something, but we are submitting something. So we will see later that here we won't use this GET method anymore with the forms, but instead of the GET, we will use POST. Okay. Okay. So what are formally the forms, or formally the forms? An HTML element that enables let me check something. That enables the users to input data and to send such data to the server for processing. So it is basically a data collection. So if we think of a form with all of its fields, it's basically a data collection that the user is submitting. It is commonly used for the user authentication. We can't think of regular user authentication without forms, and usually form search functionality. Okay. So a form basically consists of a set of input fields, Y labels in this case. I mean, input fields, we can agree that a form has an input field, right? And being an input field, the elements where you input the data. But Y labels, because in the forms next to the input field, without the label, it's not possible to have an understanding of what are you supposed to enter inside an input field. So also the labels make part of the forms, buttons and validation mechanisms, okay? To ensure that the data correctly is submitted. So as I said before, we can see that we have components for making the forms work. It has components both on the front end and then in the back end, that is the one that does the form processing. So how do we create a form in HTML? It's super easy. This is the syntax. And let's see piece by piece. So first we have the form tag, that defines an HTML element for user input. So as you can see here, we have this new tag that we haven't seen before, that is form. It opens here and it closes here, like a container or like any other HTML expression we have seen so far. Then we have the action, that is an attribute that specifies the URL with the form data should be submitted. Okay? So up to now, let's stay with that definition. The action is the URL to which the data will be submitted. Okay? Then we will see practically how that makes sense. And then we have the method. What is the method? Is the attribute that defines the HTTP method for the submission. So by default, all the default method is get. That is the one that we have been using so far, getting information from the server and getting data from the server. But in this case, for the form, we have to specify a different method. We have to say that this is a post. So that the data that is within the form and the data that is collected within the form will be submitted or sent to the server. So if we try to replicate what we have seen on the slides, then we have that here. We define a form tag that opens and closes. What happens with this? Nothing. So it doesn't have any visual impact, but because this tag is just to define that the components within those tags will be the components that make part of the form. Okay? What do we specify here? We specify the action and the method. So the action, we still don't know how it works, but with the method, we know that in this case we want to make it post. Okay, so this is the basic syntax to define a form. So, getting deeper in these HTTP methods, it basically defines the types of action that can be performed when we submit an HTTP request. So far, as I've said before, we already know get, that is to retrieve data from the server or fetching data from the server. We have post, that is the one that we will use for the forms, that is the one that is useful for sending data to the server when creating a new resource. So when we are submitting data that must make any change on the server. Then we have put, that is similar to post. Technically, both of them work the same, but conceptually and as a best practice, there is the distinction between post and put. So that post is when we want to create a resource on the backend, okay? When technically we want to create a new user, when we want to create a new post, when we want to create a new tutor, when we want to create a new resource on the backend, okay? And then put instead is when we want to update the information of some resource on the backend. So when we want to update the information of a user, when we want to update the information of a course, of a tutor, of an appointment, then in that case, we are supposed to use put. What happens if instead of put we use post? Anyway, it works because technically it's the same, behaves the same from the point of view that the data is anyway sent to the backend. But there is the conceptual definition that it is our responsibility to understand in which cases we are using a post or in which cases we're using a put. And then finally, there is the delete, that is the one that is used to remove a resource in the backend, okay? What is a resource in this context? Any entity or object that can be accessed on the backend. So in the backend, if we have a table with the records of the students, then a resource is a student that is saved in the backend, okay? So it's like a conceptual entity defined by us. There is like no formal definition or a technical definition of what is a resource, but conceptually it's an entity or an object that can be manipulated in the server, such as the data and the files. And there are two other HTTP methods that are less commonly used. Patch, that is the one that we use when we want to apply modifications to a resource, but just partial updates. And options, that is a method that gives us or retrieves which are the allowed methods for a specific resource. But these ones are basically never used. Okay, so far questions? Everything clear? Okay. So a form basically consists of several forms of HTML elements that enable user input and interaction. And there are like three control categories or three main categories that structure all the components that we have available. First, we have the input elements that are the ones useful for collecting data, such as the text, the email, the password. Then we have the selection elements. Okay, in the input elements, which one come to your mind? The text box, the text field, the password field. Well, yeah. Yeah. Also the slider, because it's a way through which we can specify a specific value. The data field, I don't know if you have seen the ones that we can pick the data. Then we have the selection ones. What is the difference between the selection ones and the input ones? In the selection, we have already a predefined set of values that we can choose from. Okay, so the selection is typically the selection box. That is this one, the drop-down menu. We have the radio buttons, because in this case it is not an open value that the user can define, but it is a predefined set of values that the user can choose from. We have the checkboxes. Well, so for instance, these 3 elements, we can set them as selection elements that enable the user to choose from predefined options. And finally, we maybe don't have the impression that this is a form element, but without the button, we can't do anything. So the button is, of course, a fundamental part of the forms, no? So the other element is the button that is useful for 2 things. One of them is to submit the form, and what is the other thing the button can be useful for? To reset the form, meaning to erase all the information and, well, don't do anything. Then we have the support elements, that in this case is the labels. So for instance, in this case, the labels are these ones: option 1, option 2, option 1, option 2. And without the labels, we can't understand what the data means. And then we have the data list that offers the predefined suggestions for the input fields. Okay? So for instance, here you can see that we have the placeholder indicating what the user should do or what information we are expecting to get. Okay, so let's try to create this one. That is like the most basic one, that is a text input. Okay, so in this case, let's check first the syntax. So we have the opening tag input and the closing tag input. Then we have here, we specify through this attribute that is typed that it is a text input. We have a name for this input field, and we have a placeholder. What do you think the placeholder means here, or this information? Yeah.
Something to show in case the element doesn't go.
Yeah, it's like the hint that is shown there when no information has been inserted by the user to give him an impression of what he should write in there. Okay, let's try this one. So here, always within the form action, we create the input. Okay, so by doing this, we're basically creating this element. And here, as you can see, the placeholder is like the hint that the user can replace. Okay? So I think it's pretty simple. And then here in the type attribute, let's take into account that this can be changed to a button, to a checkbox, to a password, email, date, color, number, month, file, hidden, and radio. Let's see what happens if we interchange those values and see how the component behaves, okay? So if, for instance, here I change text, instead of text, I write password. What do you think will happen?
When you write it will show dots.
The dots instead of the characters, okay? What do you think it will happen if instead of password I write file? in this case, it is the one that enables me to upload a file. Yeah?
Yeah, I guess this will be explained later anyway. But when uploading a file, is it stored for the duration of one session, or is it instantly?
No, it should be, when we upload a file, the file should be sent to the backend, and in the backend we have to deal with that file. We have to set that file in a specific position, and then how it usually works and how we will make it work is that in the database you will be pointing to the position in the server where the file is. Okay? Because, well, now that you did the question. Okay, in our architecture here, maybe it's not super clear. But here, I don't know if you can see the file system. So the images or the files or whatever the user uploads is then processed by the server that then saves them or stores them in a file system. And from the database, you point to the position or to the path within the file system where the files are. Okay? Question, with this file, does the placeholder attribute make sense? No, it doesn't make any sense in this case because the placeholder makes sense when we had text, for instance, because in the input it shows text. So also depending on the file of input, there are attributes that make sense or not, okay? Let's try, okay. What do you think it will happen with email? How do you think this one works? Because anyway, I can write anything. And then, if it doesn't have like the at, then it tells me insert the at because this is supposed to be a field. With the date, what happens? Well, it behaves as like the date picker, and we have also date. No, this date time doesn't work. It's just date. The color, what happens with the color? It shows like the color picker. What was the other one? The month, just to specify a specific month with the year. Fine. Yeah. And then with the radio, what happens? It becomes a radio button. Okay, the same as with checkbox, in which case it becomes a checkbox. Okay. So let's get back to the original one, that is the text. And let's continue with the slides. Okay, and up to now we, as you can see here, we don't have this value attribute anywhere, but just remember that there is this value that is the one that will help us to reference the elements that were submitted in the form, or the information that the user has input on the specific elements of the form. Okay. As I said before, the placeholder makes sense when we have a textual input inserted by the user, such as the text, such as a number, but it doesn't make any sense if we have a radio button, a checkbox, or any other element in which the user doesn't have to write anything, because in that case the placeholder is not shown. So the placeholder makes sense with this kind of input. And there are other attributes that we can use also depending on each input type. So for instance, in here, what do we think this is? It's an if I have here a number, if I try to write the characters, I can't. It won't get characters, and it will just get numerical values. Okay. What else can we add to this one? We can set like a minimum value. So if it is your age, maybe 0, and then a maximum value 100. So that here, for instance, I can't write numbers, but I can't, and if I try to send like a huge number, it says the value here must be within 0, must be less than 110, okay? So getting back here, okay, this is the one that we did in the example. Then this one, what do you think it is? So we know this is a text. By the name, we can infer this is the field in which I want to get the username. And then we have this pattern. What do you think this pattern is?
It allows only alphabetic characters.
Yeah.
And maybe only 8 characters in this case.
Yeah. So just characters, alphabetic characters with a length of 8. So we can also define these kind of patterns by using this attribute. And then in this one, how do you think this one behaves? It is the one to upload a file, but we can set some restrictions on the file uploading so that the only accepted format documents, the only accepted file formats that it will get is images or files with extension JPEG, JPG, JPEG, and PNG. Okay, indeed. Let's see how this one works. In this case, it doesn't make any sense to keep a placeholder or a min or a max for an input type, but it makes sense to have the accept attribute. Okay, this conceptually doesn't make any sense because it is supposed to be a profile picture, but what I want to show is that if I click on choose file, Then from my download folder, I can just, the only files that I can select, that I can choose, is PDF files, no? In this case, for instance, this file that is a PPTX, a PowerPoint presentation, or the images, or all of the other files are not available for being selected, but just the PDF. Okay? Okay, and there is a set of other values that we can, in this case, for instance, disable. Let's try with disabled. That is one that is commonly used. So if here if I set this one to disable, you can see that I can't click or select this one anymore, so I'm not enabled to insert values in here. So, well, this is just a disabled field. There is also the read-only option, that in this case I can select what, I mean I can select the field, but I can't write anything within it. And read only disabled, okay, yeah. In this case, with the read only and the disable, you can see that it works like a flag or like an indication within the input, just to, I mean, it doesn't have like the pattern of a key value, but it is just like a keyword that is placed there to indicate that such a specific field is read-only or that such a specific field is disabled. Okay? When do you think it might be useful to set a field as disabled or as read-only? Maybe when we have information or data that can't be modified, no? So if, for instance, I go to my profile, I don't know, on a social network, on Instagram or something like that, if I go to my profile, maybe I can see all of my information shown within a form or inserted into a form. And just the information that I can update is the one that shows in text fields that I can edit. But maybe the username or something else that is not possible to change, or the email or something like that, can be shown, can be also displayed within an input text, but is disabled so that it indicates me that it's information that I can't modify, okay? I think that's like the typical case in which we have input fields that can't be modified or are disabled. Clear? Up so far? Questions?
If one can change from disabled to habilitated to increase something, we need to use a class?
Yeah, because it has to have like a motivation so that a specific element gets enabled at some point. after performing some action, or yeah, so typically with that, with a Flask. Okay, so here what do we have? The label. What do we say the label is? Yeah, of course, the label that is associated with a specific input. So here we have the label that says tell us your story. So if we try to think of this code snippet graphically, what we will see? We will have a text that says tell us your story, and then next to the text we will have like a input field that is bigger than the one we have seen so far, that is a text area in which the user will write his story. Yep.
Calls means the number of characters in a row.
No, calls is if we try to think of the area of the text area, is like the number of characters, yeah, the number of characters within a row. Yeah, okay. Perfect. Yeah. Let me check something. Yeah, let's try to do this. Oh, okay. Okay, so here I wrote label, we have our input field, and here within label I write username. Okay. Here in the slides, you can see that it has like an attribute that is 4. Why do you think 4? Or I mean, this attribute, what do you think it is for? 2?
For class or maybe on CSS.
Somehow, but not just because the CSS.
Will refer to the ID of another type.
Yeah, somehow try to link this label with the specific element, with the specific form component that is linked to that label. Because so far, as I show you here, these two elements don't have any, any bound or any relation. It is just a text, and next to a text, an input field, but they don't have like any bounding. So as a way to say that they are bounded, we say for username. Did something change here? No, nothing changed. But conceptually, or not conceptually, but technically behind, they're now linked. So name, username, and here. Okay, and there is something that happens when we link them, and it's that when we click on the label, and now they are linked. I mean, if I now click on the label, nothing happens. But now when I link with them with the for attribute, when I click on the label, the text field enables or gets selected. Okay. And let's try this one so that we can see. So as you were asking before, the calls is the number of characters or that can be written on each row. So in this case, since we set or defined 10, there are 10 characters can be, is the space, is the unit that we set, that we enable for that space, the horizontal space, and then we have the rows, that is the number of rows that this field will have. Here, for instance, I can say 2, but what happens if I exceed the two lines? Well, it will continue below, okay? So it is not that it stops here, but it will continue below. And there is also, in some cases, the option to resize the text area. We can enable or disable this behavior within a text field. I don't remember specifically what's the attribute, but we can prevent the user from doing this. And it is also a good advice to disable such behavior because, as you can see here, when we start playing with a text area, all the layout breaks, okay? So yeah, this is an option, and okay. Let's see what happens if we copy paste this data here. Yeah.
The name field, there's
In the name field.
in T-shirt.
Ah, this one. Yeah, I think this one is the one that breaks. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Yeah, it was that one. So, okay, let's get back to here and let's fix this one. Yep, thank you. Okay, so let's make sense of this code directly here, not in the slides, but directly in the code of this component. So we have the label for the t-shirt field. We associate the field with the label with the 4 attributes. So it associated with the same, what's the way of associating it? Using the same ID on the 4, or referencing the ID of the element in the 4 attributes. So since here it is t-shirt, here we write t-shirt. Then we set t-shirt size, and then we have this component that is new. What do you think this one is for? The option component, the select component? What do you think the select is for? Is a drop-down menu where we can select an option. Okay. What is the syntax of this select element? Let's erase this. So here you can see that we have the select. We have an ID for that field and a name that is the same as if it were a text area or a text box. But let's or pay attention to the fact that here the select opens, the select closes, and within those tags we have a different kind of element that is the option. Okay? What do you think the option is for? For the options that we are allowing for that specific select. Okay? And here in option I want to emphasize on something. There is one value that is the one that is shown, and that value is specified within the 2 option tags, the one that opens and the one that closes. But what about this value attribute? Why do you think we have this value attribute? This is new because we haven't seen this value attribute, for instance, in this text field. We didn't have a value attribute. So why do you think here we have the value attribute? Okay.
Maybe it's actual value that is being sent when that option is selected.
Sure. That one is the actual value that is sent to the server when the user picks that specific option, when the user selects that specific option. Okay, so to the server, the value extra small is not the one that is being sent. Okay, it's not the information that is submitted within that form. The information or the data that will be transmitted or sent for that specific field is the one specified within the attribute value. Why we didn't or we haven't used this value attribute before? Because with the text field, what is the value that we want to submit? What the user writes. So it's not something that we have to specify. Or with the with the text area or with the file, is not something we have to specify. Here, with the options, since we are restricting the possible value to a specific set of options, we have to specify what is the value associated with each option. So what will be sent when a specific option is selected. Okay? Is it clear? Questions? Okay. Defines the data submitted. Okay, contains multiple. Okay, and then, well, a critical element, a fundamental element in the form, that is the button. And we have basically two types of buttons here, or preset buttons. The one is to submit the information, and there is another option that is to having a button to reset the information that has been inserted by the user within the form. Okay. Well, this one is a regular button. What do I have to say about these buttons? No, let's try to see what happens when we create the button. Okay, this is a super ugly form because we haven't applied any style, but it is just to show you how it behaves. Indeed, let me do something. Okay, so this is the form. We have like four fields in the form. And then we have inserted this submit and this reset button. Okay. So let's first of all see what happens with the reset button. So now nothing because anything has been inserted in here. But then if I write information, and then I said clear, what do you think it will happen? It will erase all of the information that has been specified there. Yeah. Yeah.
By the way, how do we mark these fields as not optional?
We will get to that. It is, okay, I'll tell you because it's a very good question and it's something that in the exam you always forget, but it is with this. Required. Okay, but we will get to that. Okay, so clear is super easy. How does this button knows which fields to erase? Yeah, all of the elements that are within the form tags, I mean these form tags, will be affected by that reset button. And the same question, how does this send button knows which elements to submit? All of the elements that have been defined within the form tags, okay? So these buttons have always to be within the forms, within the form definition, within the form tags. Okay. And now let's see what happens with send. Let me change something here. So the action, for instance, new. So here we have the form on the browser. And when I click send, what happens? Well, it redirects me somewhere, and where it has redirected me to this route that is called new user. That is the one that I've specified in the action, okay? So basically when I submit something, it's like I'm submitting something to a specific path, okay? So the action basically makes or references the specific path to where that information is being submitted, where that form is being submitted. Okay. Why does it doesn't make anything? What do we need to have? We need to have a route in that specific path that will take our information, will process our information, and will retrieve us a website or a visualization after we have submitted something, okay? That is the part that we will implement with Flask. But up to now, we start making sense of what the action means. The button. Okay, we have already seen the label. The reason why we use label and we associate the label with the specific field is because it improves the usability. So that, for instance, what I have shown you before, that by clicking on the label, we can see which specific field is associated with the label. That is useful for touch screens. And the way to connect the input with the specific label is using the ID attribute of the input as the value of the for within the label. Okay, so super easy. Okay, how do you think this code snippet behaves, or what we should be expecting with this code snippet? What is it? A checkbox, no? So we have a label and then we have the checkbox. Indeed. It is basically this, a label associated with this checkbox and a label associated with this checkbox. Okay? Why this association improves the usability? Because I don't have to specifically click on this, box, but also if I click over the label, it will select the option. And this is possible because they have been associated with the for attribute. Okay. In this case specifically, we can see that there is an improvement in the usability. Maybe not that much in this one, because anyway we will have to write in here, but in this one, where we have like a small areas to pick an option, it could have an improvement in the usability. Okay. Let me check. What happens if instead of checkbox I write or I set the input, the type of this input as radio? But in this case, okay. So when I had the checkbox, I had a different name for each one of the options, right? And it was fine because they should not be mutually exclusive. But if I have a radio button, what do I want? That if I select one option, then the other option automatically gets disabled. So somehow I have to group them, or to group the exclusive options, so that if one of them is selected, the other one gets deselected. So the way of linking them so that I can make them mutually exclusive is through this specific attribute that is the name. So here, since the name was different, they are being treated like different, not exclusive options. But here, if I set the names to preference, for instance, then I'm saying that, I'm sorry, let's format a little bit this. Input label. I'm saying that these two options belong or are grouped through these preference attributes, and that if the second is chosen, then the first one can't be chosen. And if I then change or switch to this one, what happens? The other one disables. So this one is particularly, or is required when working with the radio component. Okay. Let me see if I'm forgetting something. Checkbox. Okay, and of course, in Bootstrap, we can find all of the components and all of the way of styling the form components. Okay. okay, so what you asked me before, the form validation. This here is super important. It's very important, but always in the exam, you lose points because of this. And I've always been insisting on this because it's nothing difficult, it's something super easy, but maybe because it's super easy, you or the people, the students constantly forget of implementing this specific thing. So the form validation is super important because we are collecting data from the users and we have to make sure that the data that is being submitted by the users is valid data, okay? So we have to make sure that we can't assume that the users will, by default, insert valid data. A user can insert whatever he wants. We don't have control over the users that will use our application. So it is our responsibility to make sure that such information is correct, and also that is not harmful information, that we won't be storing harmful information or information that will damage our data or our backend or our application. It has two types of validation, and here is where everyone at the exam fails. Not fails, but they forget to implement this. We have to implement the validation both on the client side, but also on the server side, okay? So on the client side, what do we think is the validation? Basically what we have seen before, no? So that if we are asking for the date, maybe we can use the date type. If a specific field is required, then we can set the required flag. If it is a password, then or if it has like a maximum length, then we can specify the maximum length. So the validations that we do on the front end or on the HTML. But we also have to implement the validations on the server side. That is, if the information that the user has submitted me meets the criteria. Why do you think we have to implement the validation on the server side if we already have validated information on the front end? Because if there is an attacker or someone that wants to do harmful actions on our website or on our web application, they might not be using the graphical interface that we have implemented, but they might be sending a request maybe from the console or from a terminal, like a terminal command. No? Because anyway, we can submit data to a specific endpoint by using terminal commands. So if we don't validate the data also on the backend, maybe a request that is not coming from someone using the front end or the data that the form that we have implemented can anyway be harmful or do something on the backend. I think this will make more sense when we will implement the routes with Flask, but let's keep the idea in mind. So, okay, so on the front end, on the client side, before the submission, we have to check, well, for instance, to protect the user data, it improves the user experience, but we must never trust the client-side validation on the server, okay? So which kind of validations we can make? We have seen some of them. So for instance, if we are expecting an email, we can set the type email. If we are expecting a URL, we can set the type to a URL or to number. Then we have required, that as its name suggests, is when we want a specific field to be required or to be mandatory. Then we have the pattern that informs a custom regex pattern with at least 3 characters. We have min length, max length, that is for the text values, which are like the minimum and the maximum character length. And then we have min and max, that this one is not for text characters, but for numerical values. So which is the minimum number and the maximum number that is acceptable. So for instance, in here, you can see that all of the fields, apart from what we have seen so far, they have these validations, no? So from these validations, for instance, in the first one, we are getting sure that this is an email that has the email format and that this one is mandatory, no? Also the second one, it is supposed to be a website, so we are making sure it is a URL and we are saying that it is mandatory. In the third one, we are doing more validations. We are getting sure that this is a text. We are making sure that this is a alphabetical characters that has a length within 3 to 10. So the username must be from 3 to 10 characters long. And also we apply such attributes to make sure that this is the min and the max length, and we set this one as required. And finally, for the age, we specify that the minimum value that we will accept is 18, the maximum 19, and is also required. What will happen when I try to submit something that is required? Indeed, let's see what happens. If, for instance, here I said that the username is required, and I try to submit the form without filling out that specific field, it will say fill this field before submitting the form. Okay, so just by adding this keyword, I'm making the front-end validation. Okay. Up to now, everything is clear. Questions? Have you tried on the computer? Does it work? Fine, so let's take a break, a 15 minutes break. We'll see here at 10:05, and then we will see how this makes sense on the back end, or how we deal with the data on the back end, okay?